the mythology that they were spinning out. They were also wondering about suddenly going from a tribal hunter-gatherer horticultural society. They were one of the very first experiments going into living together in big cities and the division of labor and all of those forces at play. They were having conflicts with that. How do you see that in that mythology?
Yeah, you know, Sumer fascinates me. It's one of my favorite areas of study because it's a kind of test case scenario for the oldest myths that we have on record.
A test case scenario for the oldest myth. Explain that real quick.
Yeah, in other words, it's like a laboratory in which the very first experiment in civilization came about, and we have the record of what happened as far as what the psyche of that civilization thought about it on paper, as it were.
Well, in cuneiform tablets, and there was abundance of those tablets, so they have left us a very big legacy of the written word, which we can read.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if you want to go back to find the earliest myths, you really have to go to two places, Sumer and Egypt, both of whom start writing down their myths at about the same time. But I want to mention something about what the curious thing about that is that when you look at the dates and what was going on in the societies when these first myths actually start to be recorded, those two civilizations were entering a phase where they were beginning to fall apart. So in other words, we have the earliest myths that we have are records of a society in crisis. And the reason this is so is because what we don't realize is that most people commit their myths to writing when they're about to lose them, when the society's falling apart. You know, the Native American myths that we have, you know, recorded by the Ethnographic Bureau and all these volumes are a sort of, you know, flare shot up into the sky from the sinking ruin of the Native American civilization. And and in the same case with Sumer, as Sumer was beginning to fall apart as a society, something happened called the Third Dynasty of Ur, which was a great period right around the year 2000 of restoration and backward looking. The Sumerians were looking back at glories that had been. They knew the society was falling apart, and they recorded their myths finally. They actually finally wrote them down and recorded them. And those are the myths, the earliest myths that we have. So they're already associated with a period of social and cultural decadence. The same thing in Egypt at about the same time took place with the earliest Egyptian myths, which are in the pyramid texts. And the pyramid texts they're a little bit earlier than the Third Dynasty of Ur. They're closer to 2500 BC. But those texts were written down just towards the end of the Old Kingdom when the mortuary practices were changing and when pharaohs in particular were becoming anxious that the priests, once they had buried, just forgot about them and would leave and no longer stand and through oral recitation perform the sacred utterances that would help save Pharaoh's soul in the afterlife and guard him against demons and monsters. And the pharaohs knew that the mortuary priests were no longer doing it. They weren't upholding, even in the time of the Fifth Dynasty, they were no longer tending the mortuaries of the Great Pyramids in the Fourth Dynasty. That's why they actually wrote the pyramid text down onto the walls of the pyramids of the Fifth Dynasty, and that's why we have them, because they were afraid, you know, that they were going to be forgotten.
Now, let me ask you real quick. So the whole thing about keeping the afterlife and keeping the soul of the pharaoh alive was the continual recitation by the priests of these sacred texts. They thought that they had to daily or whatever on a regular basis go in there and stir the pot, so to speak, stir the ethers.
Exactly.
And that their best substitution was to put them on the walls, because you walk into the tombs and if they won't stand there and recite them, at least they're written on the walls, and that is a substitute. That's fascinating.
That's exactly right.
Wow.
And that's why we have the earliest records of these myths in both cases, in Sumer and in Egypt. They're associated with periods of a society about to fall apart. And, you know, shortly after the Fifth Dynasty, right about the Sixth Dynasty, the Old Kingdom falls apart and collapses, and it falls into what's known as the First Intermediate Period, which is a period of chaos and anarchy that reigned in Egypt, in which all the art forms fell apart. The art from that period is very provincial and folksy and kitschy. It's very bad. People forgot how to do things. And it was a miniature Dark Age before it got restarted again with the Middle Kingdom. And the same thing happened in Sumer after the Third Dynasty of Ur when they started writing down their myths. The Third Dynasty of Ur was overrun and destroyed, and then came in the Babylonians. And the Babylonians, under Hammurabi, about the year 1750 or so, inaugurate a new period of splendor, and they start writing down myths that they've inherited from the Sumerians, but they change them. They bring in a totally new emphasis that the Sumerians didn't have. And one of those emphases that they brought in was a real shift in the attitude toward the goddess. The Babylonians were originally these Amorite, tough, fierce warrior tribesmen from the hills of Palestine and Judea who gradually filtered in and took over Sumerian society, which had by that time fallen into a period of civil war. And they took it over, and once they got on the throne, they disrespected and pushed out a lot of the ancient Sumerian traditions regarding the goddess. And one of those key traditions was the theory of kingship, which was the idea that the Sumerian king ruled because he had the sanctification of a goddess. And the goddess was, of course, Inanna. Sometimes it could be another goddess named Ninhursag, but usually it was Inanna. And you find in depictions of ancient art, Inanna will handing over to the king at the moment of his coronation, she will hand over the rod and the ring. And the rod and the ring are these symbols of the Earth's celestial equator. That's the ring, and the rod is its axis. And the king is the incarnation of it was Inanna. And you find in depictions of ancient art, Inanna will handing over to the king at the moment of his coronation, she will hand over the rod and the ring. And the rod and the ring are these symbols of the Earth's celestial equator. That's the ring, and the rod is its axis. And the king is the incarnation of the axis of the Earth. And she hands that over to him as a means of saying, I bequeath you king, and you are king under my name. And many of the Sumerian kings had, at the moment of their coronation, would actually change their names and incorporate goddess names into their names. Namu is an example of that, for example. Namu is an old water goddess. And but then when the Babylonians came in, they got rid of this idea, this nonsense that, kingship could be conferred by a goddess or a woman. It had to be a man, because these were patriarchal peoples who had come from the hills, and that's how their chieftains ruled their tribes, and they continue those traditions on into Sumer. And as a result of that, you see in Hammurabi's great stele, this wonderful, I think it's a granite or a diorite stele, in which he is seen on the throne at the moment of coronation receiving the rod and ring not from the goddess, but from the sun god Shamash. And some scholars say it may actually be Marduk, but they can't agree. It's either Marduk or Shamash. Either way, the rod and the ring is coming now from a male deity. So the old Sumerian traditions of kingship coming from the goddess are repudiated, starting from that point on. And
so
right
this is
down
the
to
rise of the
times, we
patriarchy.
inherit it.
This
Yeah.
is one of the first rallying cries of the patriarchy, pushing the goddess or the feminine off its pedestal.
Yeah, one of the first. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are earlier. I mean, a lot of people have a romantic view of the Sumerians as goddess worshippers, and the women ran the society and all that, but that really isn't true. The Sumerians had gender issues as well, and you can find in a lot of the Sumerian myths that are written down, you can already see the goddess being displaced. There are a number of struggles recorded, particularly between the two great Sumerian deities, Enki, who is the lord of the inventor of irrigation, and he is the lord of the intellect and arts and crafts. He's basically the mental god. And Enlil is the other god, who's the god of the stormy sky. He will later eventually become Yahweh in the Bible. He brings the floods. And he's the god who lives in a palace on a mountaintop and commands all the waters and the storms and so forth. And those two gods are recorded on a number of occasions raping women and taking their powers away from them. And Enki and another goddess named Ninhursag, for example, participate in a contest as to who can make the first human beings. And Enki makes these little creatures out of clay, and then he challenges the goddess to name what the function will be for each deficient being that he makes. So he makes a human being, without any genitals, and the goddess says, well, this will be a eunuch in the king's palace, and so forth. But when it comes time for the roles to be reversed, the goddess is incapable of creating, and she can't compete with him, and so he takes over her role as creatress. And from that point, you can see, the next step is the book of Genesis, where you have a male deity creating entirely without the aid of any goddess whatsoever. And, drawing Eve as a rib from Adam, as though women, came from the male body, which they don't. It's the other way around.
It just shows you the importance of myth when you spin out these stories. Maybe they're not even spoken aloud, but you have these assumptions. And